Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Conversations That Matter. This is a webinar series that's sponsored by the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame, where we focus on the topic of human dignity and offer some pastoral strategies for addressing some of the pressing human dignity issues in the church today. So our current series of conversations deals with the rise of the machines, how the internet, social media, and AI are raising questions about what it means to be human in an increasingly digital world. My name is Brett Robinson. I'm an associate professor of Catholic Media Studies in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. The McGrath Institute's an outreach unit at Notre Dame that connects the intellectual life of Notre Dame to the life of the church through teaching, research, and programming. And this is one of those programs. Today, we are calling it The Virtue of Art. And I'd like to introduce our three guests today, all artists in their own right. First, Nick Ripatrazone, who's an author, editor, writer, and teacher. He's written 7 books of literary criticism, poetry, short stories, and a novella. And he's the culture editor for Image Journal, in addition to contributing to the Catholic Herald, among many other publications. He's also an English teacher in New Jersey at Lenape Valley Regional High School. Our second guest is Renée Roden, who's a journalist, writer, and playwright. She's a graduate of Notre Dame's Master's in Theological Studies program and Columbia School of Journalism. She's a writer reporting on religion and social issues and has written for a variety of national and international publications. Her recent work in playwriting involves a play called Is the Internet in Color? That explores the interplay of memory, encounter, and humanity in the digital world. That project, a product of the Church Communications Ecology program, out of which this webinar series was launched. Finally, Stephen Barany, who's an artist and assistant professor at Holy Cross College in the Visual Arts program. He has a BA in Philosophy and Industrial Design from Notre Dame, an MDiv from Notre Dame, and a Master's of Fine Arts in Illustration and Visual Culture from the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Wash U in St. Louis. It's an exemplary group that we have here today. We imagine this to be a conversation, so we will be in conversation, myself and our panelists, and hopefully with all of you as we entertain and receive your questions and comments throughout the course of today's proceedings. This is a 1-hour webinar. It will be recorded, and we'll be providing those links after today's session. So, the virtue of art, what do we mean by that? We're doing this in the context of this virtual apocalypse series. How do we renew Christian culture in the context of a digital world? And we're thinking very deeply, both in the previous episode and this episode, about that word context. So what does the context or environment that we're situated in, how does it shape cultural expression, social interaction, spirituality, education, all of these important things that we as church leaders and folks in the university think about quite often. So today we want to think about how the experience of making and enjoying art reminds us of what it means to be human in a world of increasing automation and AI. So last time we talked about how the technological environment shapes perception, shapes our habits, shapes our ways of being in the world. And our focus was, what are those practices or habits or virtues that we need to grow spiritually and socially and culturally in this context? And so in this episode, we want to think about the way in which art serves as a counter environment to the technological environment. And what do we mean by that? This is a term that we borrow from Marshall McLuhan, this idea that we live in this cultural environment that's very shaped by these technologies and practices that we're all immersed in, Zoom, one of them, but that art in some ways can reveal to us how our perception, how our habits are changing as a result of this immersion in these technologies. So we've gathered 3 great artists and writers today to think about these questions with us, and we want to think with all of you about that. So I want to start with our author and writer, Nick Ripatrazone, because I want to start with a question about books. For 500 years, we lived in a print culture right up through the late 19th century, and then along comes electricity, and not far behind it, radio, television, then the computer, the internet, all within the last century or so. And so books, once the predominant media for cultural expression and information sharing and cataloging and memory of culture, now giving way to these new technologies and tools, and certainly changing the culture. So books didn't go away, though. Literature has changed as a result of this. And I'd love to ask you, Nick, just to get things started, how has literature and storytelling adapted to remain relevant in a digital culture of screens and speed and AI?
Sure. I'm happy you mentioned Marshall McLuhan. I'm sure that many of our attendees are familiar with him, but Marshall McLuhan was a Canadian media theorist, primarily working in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and his work has really influenced me, and I think influenced many parts of the Notre Dame program with church communications and media ecology. McLuhan is one of those thinkers who not a lot of people realize, first of all, that he was Catholic and how deeply Catholic his vision was. So when you talk about books, that was a great interest of McLuhan. His book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, was looking at what he called the rapid transition in Gutenberg's time of the book going from something that was, he called it memorized, to something that would be referenced. And of course, he's talking about the mass production or reproduction of books that was enabled with the advent of the printing press. So when you ask the question to me about kind of the moment right now, what is a book for us and how does it exist as maybe a work of art? I think of how McLuhan saw this as a continuum of changes. So it's really common, I think, when we talk about technology, and I say we, kind of anybody who talks about technology, to feel like we're the first generation or the first moment that really has to make some decisions to keep things the way they were, or to kind of give in to modernity or some sort of changing digital, possibility. When in actuality, McLuhan, and I would kind of certainly agree with him, that this is a continual process, that the book has evolved and will continue to evolve. And in many ways, it harkens to this idea McLuhan had of obsolescence. So the word obsolescence refers to not something that has completely gone away, so it's not obsolete, but it's on its way out. So McLuhan kind of infamously or famously wrote a book called The Mechanical Bride that he thought was somewhat of a disappointment, because he felt like the argument that he was making about print advertising was already an outdated argument. And he realized that his attention really needed to be changed and focused on television. And that's really what kind of affected his media vision. So I look at books not as obsolete. I don't think they're ever going to be. I think they're just in another phase of obsolescence from what we typically assume they could be or should be. And I would once again agree with McLuhan that now is the time in that obsolescence moment where Catholic artists, Catholic thinkers, Catholic readers can really be participatory in shaping what that next version is. So McLuhan was very big in not being passive in this process. He didn't necessarily love the coming electronic world, but he absolutely, as you can tell by Googling his name just for a moment, he appeared on television, he appeared on radio, he was everywhere. He was in every magazine that you can imagine, and oftentimes on the cover. So he was a pop star at the same time that he was very much aware that those old things that we live with, such as books, were shifting. And I think it's important to remember that McLuhan was an English professor. When we talk about him as a media theorist, that's something he evolved into. So I think in order to understand where we're going next, we should return to books and that physical artifact.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because his dissertation, of course, was on the classical trivium. He was a literary scholar. Mm-hmm. And if you read the Gutenberg Galaxy, it reads like a history of the church, read through the evolution of the book. And so as we think about ourselves as Christians, as Catholics, people of the book, some people would say the traditional religions, Judeo-Christian religions, and now with the book in a sort of this weird sort of obsolescent stage, that raises some interesting questions about faith and relationship to scripture and how we read and how we receive information and tradition as it's passed on. I'm wondering, Nick, as I think about some of the popular writing about this topic, like Nicholas Carr's book on The Shallows, how people are reading differently, shorter attention spans. Marianne Wolf's Reader Come Home. A lot of concern among book-minded people about whether people are able to read, able to enter into that contemplative space of reading. But to your point, I think there's, in literature anyway, an opportunity to reveal some of these effects, some authors that maybe have started to document these effects in a sort of artistic way to help us see what that means for culture, what it means when people don't read as much. You think of Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 450. I mean, there's all sorts of classic examples and then more recent ones. Are there any you can think of, novels, short stories, things that are good at revealing these effects for us, helping us to come to terms with these changes?
Yeah, I think contemporary of McLuhan, the American writer Thomas Pynchon, who also was a Catholic, whose Catholicism his college roommate said he would go to church and confession, and his roommate didn't know why, because he was such sort of a square, like he didn't really do anything wrong, but Mitch Pynchon was going to confession all the time. And Thomas Pynchon wrote a novel, The Crying of Lot 49, from 1966, and it's this really weird Southern California satire. And in one of the first scenes of the book, this woman, Oedipa Maas, is standing in the living room of a home, and she's staring at the TV, and she's a little bit kind of inebriated, like she had like an afternoon party, and she's looking at the TV, and there's like this hypnotic kind of electronic moment. And then all throughout the book, there's electronic music, which in 1966 was kind of in its early stages. There are parties with electronica. There's sort of this idea that things are on the vanguard, the shift to a more electronic world. And she's searching for this text that she wants to find to uncover what she sees as the key to a conspiracy. So as you're reading the book, it's almost like Pynchon is writing a story, but he's also giving us like a puzzle. And that is very interesting, I think, to readers in 2023, the idea of participatory culture. And, another Catholic novelist, James Joyce, if you read Ulysses feels like a book that's kind of put together by someone who's a Catholic prankster. Like they're trying to almost create, before hypertext was a thing, they created these multiple levels of text. So Pynchon's novel, I feel like, is a fun ride for people. And then in 1984, he came out with his collection, Slow Learner, and he wrote an essay for the New York Times Magazine called Is It Okay to Be a Luddite? And he wrote about the historical Luddites, who were essentially people whose life was being displaced, or their livelihood was being displaced by the kind of exclusive usage of textile machines. So they weren't anti-technology, they were anti the bosses taking away their jobs and taking away their livelihood. So they would be smashing these machines. So that like the band literally Rage Against the Machine is like that rage against those things. They're smashing them at night. And what Pynchon says is they've been misunderstood in history, that we usually say a Luddite now to someone who does not want to touch a smartphone, who doesn't want to use the internet. But in actuality, the original Luddite was someone who was very concerned what technology would do to displace us. So there's always been this fear of that. So I feel like reading a writer like Pynchon opens our eyes to that kind of historical basis for these concerns. And then I would also throw out there Don DeLillo, his book, Zero K. I think it's a great book. I don't think it's not my favorite of his books. There's other books I like more, but Zero K has a really interesting focus on the idea of a screen. So DeLillo always has this kind of metaphor of the screen kind of running images in front of us, and it's almost in all of his novels. So I would kind of invite Catholic readers, and really any readers interested in technology and the soul, to look into books like that to see how they offer us a very contemporary way to look at this, even if they're from a few years ago.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of Don DeLillo's White Noise, which was adapted for Netflix. For those of you who haven't encountered these authors, that's kind of an interesting way into their world. That one mostly about television and consumerism, but an interesting rendering, because it is kind of a send-up of television, White Noise is. So to see it rendered on television adds another level of meta analysis and awareness. So yeah, these are great examples because again, Catholic writers, including James Joyce, going back, as you said, who are sort of tapping into the moment, illustrating it in these sort of creative ways and helping us kind of come up with a grammar or vocabulary for understanding the effects of what's going on and reflecting on that. I think that's the key here is how do we reflect on this thoughtfully and not sort of mindlessly follow the machine along. And I'm wondering, I'm asking all the group here, as you look at what ChatGPT is doing with writing and creativity, it's still in obviously a very rudimentary stage, but both visual art and writing. I mean, do you feel like smashing the machine, raging against the machine as journalists and writers?
Well, sorry. I just want to, I think I'll be able to answer this question, Brett, but I'm going to rewind to something that Nick said, because he brought up the Thomas Pynchon essay, Is It Okay to Be a Luddite? Which I instantly went and read when you first referenced it. I was like, I'm very curious. Is it okay to be a Luddite? And I think I struggle with what you were sort of invoking at the beginning of this talk, Brett, with we're not here to completely, or you were saying, Nick, too, like Marshall McLuhan didn't completely dismiss this sort of electronic evolution, this evolution of humanity into different media ages, because I have that Luddite instinct to smash the smartphone. But then also when I was reading Thomas Pynchon's essay, he talks about how writers, these artists who are supposed to be reflecting on our environment and our culture are sort of thoughtlessly gravitating to word processors. And, I felt very convicted by that, or I just felt very condemned. That's the word I'm looking for, because I've always written, seen, but also judged, but I've always written on a word processor. I'm of an age where that was just always, when I first began to write seriously, that's how I began to write. And I think kind of going to your question, Brett, about ChatGPT, that, and I've heard what I would call grouchy old writers from the 40s, 50s, 60s, complain about word processors, talk about how different it is to write longhand and then type it up on a typewriter. And I think I've also begun to reflect how my writing process, if it's entirely in a digital space, I can often begin by writing trash because there's this blank screen in front of you, and you're like, okay, well, and there is some good advice in that in terms of writing, just get a first draft down, just like get something down. But actually, when you write something down freehand, it's different. You write differently, you're processing differently than when I'm just trying to fill a screen. I've begun to notice the quality of that work, the quality of that writing is different. And I do actually think that matters. I think that maybe perhaps when I begin to write a first draft on a word processor, just trying to get it out there, trying to get something down, I maybe write more like a machine than I do when I begin freehand writing on paper. I think this is something I've noticed as we begin to talk about ChatGPT, is like ChatGPT is perhaps terrifying or disturbing because it mimics back to us how bad our writing is and how much like machines and robots we sound like.
So there's an insight here around incarnationality too, the embodied act of writing with a pencil or pen and paper versus the sort of more abstract or virtual act. I mean, you're still touching something physical, the material keyboard, but you have this virtual space in which to create, which feels kind of infinitely uncomfortable, whereas the paper is finite and there's a certain sacramentality to it. If you go back to your old notebooks or journals, there's a nostalgia, a wistfulness about this time in my life, these thoughts that I had, that's hard to capture in a Google Drive, for example. And I think that's a good point. And I think on the other side, the receiving side, if I receive a text versus a, say, written note, there's a different effect that has on me, regardless of the content of that note. There's that famous story of Nietzsche getting the typewriter and beginning to write on a typewriter, and his whole writing style changed. It became much more sort of staccato and really mimicked the shape of the machine. And I think that's what you're pointing to, Renée. And that's really what I think we're trying to get at today, is this notion of form and embodiment, and how that changes the shape of the art and the reception of the art. And so it's something to pay attention to in a digital world. I want to invite Stephen in here too. I know you're a visual artist, Stephen, but how are these sort of things striking you as these developments occur?
Yes, I'll just start where Renee went and then maybe return to some of the other ideas. But yeah, definitely when we are designing, so I kind of live half in the design world and half in the fine arts world, and it's the difficult tension because I would be more inclined. I'm someone who journals by hand. I always do thumbnails by hand. I encourage my students to do thumbnails by hand. But when you are designing and you're creating something visual for the goals of communication, it's something that will essentially be consumed and then passed over. It's something that's not necessarily to be revisited. And so in those cases, I'm more inclined to be open to things like computer generated design or the ways that a computer can help us to accomplish these communication tasks more efficiently. But then the flip side is that if you are attempting to create something that is deeply human, or I think I would say worth revisiting, then very quickly you find the limitations of the computer programs, because by virtue of beginning there, you're already accepting a whole world that is described by the parameters of what a computer program is capable of doing, how you make shapes there, what is considered perfect and imperfect. So all of those things manifest themselves very rapidly when you're creating with the starting point of the digital versus in analog.
Let me go back to Renee for just a moment. Speaking of embodiment and the creative process, because you're a playwright, and theater is a form that really predates all these other media we're talking about, digital and electric and print. What do you think it is about theater, I guess, that gives it its staying power, and kind of what role does it offer us now in this new environment?
Yeah, I think that's a good question that probably is going to keep getting asked and answered as humans grow older and theater grows older with them. But I think theater just has, it's using a very easy, accessible medium to tell a story, which is ourselves, something everyone has. I love being a playwright, and I've always loved working in theater, because anytime you tell someone, I was a theater major in undergrad at Notre Dame, I've continued working in theater in various sort of amateurish ways after graduating, and everyone has a story. I mean, I could ask this panelist, have all of you been in a school play at some point? Nick, no? I know you were Bob Cratchit, right? Yeah, famously. Wait, Nick, have you never been in a play?
I've never have.
Okay,
But I teach, so I'm just performing and
right, exactly.
lying all day long.
I think you're the first person I've ever met who has never told me about their middle school play that they were a part of. And maybe people in the Q&A can prove me wrong as well. But I feel like most people I meet have some story, like telling them you work in theater or dabble in theater instantly sort of draws up like, oh, I was Bob, Brad has told me his story of being Bob Cratchit, right? Like everyone has this sort of memory of what that is, or being in the Christmas pageant, right? There's all these sorts of ways in which once someone tells you they work in this art, they're like, oh, I have this memory of doing this too. And that is, I think, something so beautiful, that community theater still exists, that there is this, that there are all these ways that storytelling is embedded in what it means to be a human and have a culture. I think, I think like many things, theater has become very professionalized in the United States, and it has become very corporatized, right? But there is still, so like coming out of New York, I think I just moved from New York to Chicago. And I think one of the things I'm noticing in cities right now is the death of sort of this, the pandemic has really done a number on independent theaters, small theaters, theaters that were a group of college friends that got together and started a theater company, that in some ways it's really like the biggest, most corporate theaters that have survived the pandemic in these big theater cities. But I think there's something very essential and accessible about theater, which is that we're just telling the story among a group of friends. Really, anyone can do it. You don't have to be great. You don't have to be a method actor. So I think, at least for me, who's never been able to paint or draw worth a dang, like I feel like theater is so much, there's not much skill you need to learn beyond memorizing lines or saying them, which are things anyone can kind of do to a various degree. So I think that's why theater has staying power, is because anyone can do it. All you have to do is have a community. And I think of just coming what we've been coming out of, right? The Triduum. It is, I've been thinking a lot about the word pageantry and how liturgy and theater are sort of connected in some way. This need to perform or reenact a story, to have it live inside our bodies, to say words out loud, not just think them in our heads. Like what performance actually does to us, right? And I think there's this way in our faith that's so connected to this deepest mystery of our faith, right? The Easter Vigil is every year us sort of not just performing or reenacting in a shallow way, but in a very deep way, like reliving our baptism and recommitting to this, re-performing it in some way. And just as, you know, the Eucharist is this anamnesis, this like recreation or this performance, this repetition of Christ's sacrifice. And I think that's something I've been thinking of. I just was, you know, on Good Friday, you know, the whole veneration of cross, all these sorts, there's these moments of pageantry, the washing of the feet on Holy Thursday, throughout the Triduum. So I really have been thinking of, you know, what it seems in many ways, this pageantry, this liturgical act doesn't survive if it's just relegated to the church. Like this feels like there's this deep need for it to also be performed in other spaces.
Well, you're in Chicago, Renee, and I think you're familiar with the Athenaeum project there. They have this beautiful 100-year-old theater that's connected to a parish. And I'm wondering from you and from our panelists, you know, where this sort of stuff lands, say in the parish or the school. Nick, you're a teacher. It seems to me, listening to you all, that this mode of awareness, this sort of artistic process and the ability to engage with art and understand it as a way of understanding ourselves and our age is essential as an educational and as a spiritual enterprise. So in a world of STEM education and sort of over-reliance on technological tools, how might we, I don't know, land some of this in the parish environment, in the school environment, so that these practices, habits, the pageantry, the performance, the reception, you know, the reading can become part of that human experience of growing in faith and growing in community. And this is open to anyone, including our visitors who might have comments or questions or examples of this happening in their own communities.
I have a thought real quick. One was when, Renee, you mentioned there's this been a decline maybe in like grassroots theater companies or friends getting together and performing. And then I thought immediately, well, is there a way that, you know, social media like TikTok or Instagram are methods for people to perform almost like micro theater? And the plays themselves are very short. We know many of them, like, oh, look, I got this new thing. Like that's a very short, like micro play that someone performs on, or I'm visiting this amazing, beautiful place. Like that's another short micro play. So then the follow-up thought to answer your question, Brett, is, well, how do we allow people to do that maybe in a parish or school setting? And I think, you know, embodiment is something that we're kind of dancing around today. And one thought I had was like, if you think about a play as something in the scientific way where you're like, oh, I'm going to analyze this play. When was it written? Who wrote it? Who are the characters? What are the characters' motivations? There is something very good about that and empathy building. But also thinking about play or plays or story as a lens through which you look at and make meaning and interpret the world. It's kind of flipping it around on its head. So if we could find ways to encourage ourselves or invite other people to explore their lives or explore topics through play or storytelling, then it actually makes the story the lens through which you see the world versus the thing that you're just analyzing and using the scientific lens over and over again.
Yeah, getting away from over intellectualizing things and doing it in an embodied form. There's some examples. Charlie Gillespie, who teaches out in Connecticut, does this drama work where you take sort of documentaries and you turn it into a drama. And I'm imagining the lives of saints. Like imagine getting a school group together or a parish community group together, even if they're amateurs, and saying, we're going to enact, perform the life of this saint. Maybe it's the named saint for the parish or another saint that's special to that community. What better way to get that in your body, right? To get that sense of who this person was and why they're important in the faith, and to sort of act it out, live it out, and not just read it in a book, for example. I think these are great opportunities for Catholic ministers and teachers to think about alternative modes of education and formation that pull from the arts, because that artistic and creative process can be so enriching.
And I think, oh, sorry, not to cut you off, Brett.
Go ahead.
But I just think, to add on to what Stephen said, I feel like because you made this interesting point where people may be using social media for performance or for plays or dramas. And I think it's one thing that we're hurting for as an embodied culture is public space. So much of our public space is the internet. It's now not actually physical space, which is beautiful in that it's equally accessible, I suppose, right? There's sort of an equal access. But I think it is difficult. When I deleted Twitter this fall, I thought, where will I go to be in public? That was the first thought I had, right? That was the space I had gone for 5 years, to be in public. And I think that is something that churches can offer. Churches, the Catholic Church in the United States has a lot of land, right? And it is for kind of rethinking that sort of religious space as a public space, I think can help foster this creativity, this embodied creativity.
Nick, what are you seeing as a teacher in schools, maybe even returning to the book question a little bit? Where are students, where's their attention drawn? What's sort of turning them on in terms of, I just read a story yesterday about a young man who was learning about Christianity on TikTok, and that's what brought him back to the church. So we don't want to necessarily dispense with some of these technologies that seem a little either nefarious or waste of time, because they can be portals or gateways back to that real public space or religious space that Renee is describing. I don't know though. What are you seeing with high school students?
Well, I see a lot of, I guess the for me, both on this question and culture in general, I feel like the secular and sacred, or the secular and public non-sectarian spaces, to me, are pretty porous, the border between them, so I feel as if people move pretty often between faith and non-faith, or lapsed or practicing, or however we want to frame it. And I feel like that's especially true with younger people who are influenced by multiple things, but also kind of trying to find themselves. And part of, I think, just maturation and formation is trying out those different kind of ways of looking at the world to figure out who you are. And it's funny because I had been reading an old issue of America magazine, which of course is still published, but I was reading an issue from the 50s, and there was I believe his name is Edward Corbett, the guy who did a lot of those rhetoric textbooks that comp professors had to use and also learn from. And he wrote an essay for America saying that he was kind of in shock that all of the winners, or many of the winners, of the famous Atlantic Monthly writing competitions came from colleges that were taught by nuns. Essentially, they were small girls' schools, and they were destroying like the major public institutions. And like he kind of put in like the snide comment about like they're even beating the Jesuits out, like the nun taught colleges like were the best. And I was thinking how the Atlantic Monthly is obviously not a Catholic publication. So you had young Catholic women, Catholic artists writing for and participating in the secular artistic culture, but retaining their Catholicity, their sort of Catholic identity. So I feel like that is an essential part for Catholic artists, is to not, although being sort of among Catholics, I think is very warming sort of to the heart and to the mind, perhaps. There's an important sort of outsourcing and kind of broader conversation that has to happen within artistry. And when you look at the great Catholic artists of even like the past 50 years, sometimes you have to hunt for their quote Catholicism on the page, but you can sense it there. So I feel like with younger students, starting with the art and then getting to perhaps the faith or the theology is the way to kind of bring them in. I mean, we're talking about plays, and when I teach plays in class, the most recent text that we read was The Bold Soprano by Eugene Ionesco, which is this wonderful farce that descends into like a devolution of language at the end. And the kids are laughing at it and they're smirking. And that's the moment sort of where people are, as you say, most fully embodied in the artistic moment, because they realize that language has that other level. So I feel like leading with the artistry and leading with kind of the story, and then we sort of discover the other theological components, that feels like the best way to bring in younger readers and younger people.
Yeah, we have a comment from Frank in Austin, at Austin Catholic High School, who where they do STEAM instead of STEM. So they add the A, and they use thinking skills related to art across the curriculum. So that's another way perhaps into all this. And also Isaac also from Austin, whose parish does a passion mime, which is kind of like a passion play. And he did one back in high school and opened him up to experiencing the gospel in a completely different way. So as you say, the artistic experience kind of by itself can be a doorway through which one comes to encounter faith. It's maybe indirect, it may be interpretive, but it's certainly a very viable and has been for centuries. As anyone knows who's gone to Rome and been converted on the spot by the beauty and grandeur of a place like that, with all the art and architecture. I'm wondering though, among the three of you, how your process perhaps has changed throughout the course of this kind of technological evolution. Are there things you're doing now that you weren't doing 5 or 10 years ago? Stephen mentioned some things around computer generated design. But just ways you've adapted as an artist and for better or worse.
Maybe I'll start. There are a lot of advantages to creating digitally, and in a lot of ways, as technology advances, and we can use Apple pencils and like drawing tablets. It helps to bridge the gap between the analog and the digital. And actually, for me, something I've adopted recently is I've started to do more of my drawing digitally because I can actually draw for long. It's like physiologically healthier for me to sit in a good like upright posture and draw looking at the screen versus like hunched over and like neck pain and like this weird shoulder thing that I'm doing. So that's been an advantage for me. At the same time, as McLuhan warns us, like each time a media extends you or technology extends you, there's a concomitant amputation. And so even though I do all those things, the sheer pleasure of using a pencil or a pen and like the texture on paper, all of those things are missing. And then I have also found in myself like a hesitance to just go out and draw in a sketchbook or something, because each time I draw it digitally, I can just undo, or I can redo, or I can like stretch something or skew it and expand it. But it's like when I go out into the world and if I draw from life, then suddenly all of my errors are made manifest to me and my inadequacies. So that's a disadvantage, but it also helps me to become better and reveals my own humanity to myself.
Stephen, you mentioned that we were talking earlier about the evil piano teacher. Can you tell us that story? I think there's something there because I'd like to get at this idea of how the development of virtue through art, through creative process, has a lot to do with what you're describing. Can you tell us about that example?
Sure. Yes. When I was in a class, I don't know if it was early Christianity, I think it was, with John Cavadini, who actually runs the McGrath Institute, directs the McGrath Institute. He used this example, I believe, with Irenaeus. And St. Irenaeus was talking about how God allows us the latitude to struggle because then the growth is proper to ourselves. It's our own growth. And he used this image of the evil piano teacher. And the evil piano teacher is the piano teacher where when you are with them, you can play any musical piece in the world. You are a piano player par excellence. But when you are not with the evil piano teacher, you have no ability at the piano. So, well, what has the evil piano teacher taught you? They haven't taught you anything because the perfection is theirs. It's not your own. And so I think there is something akin to that with the digital in, working with students, or even seeing it myself. You sort of assume like, well, isn't there a filter that can make it look like this photograph is drawn? Or isn't there some program I just tell it what I want it to look like and it just makes it for me? Well, sure, you can do all of those things, but then you're no longer the artist. You're no longer the designer. It's the perfection of the computer that's producing these things on your behalf. And so the growth that you would have had, the struggle that you have had, all of the human development, but also aesthetic or technical development you would have had is actually not your own. It belongs to someone or something else.
I think, so I think I tend to often take a very overly stereotypical Luddite stance towards technology, but I actually feel like in my own process, nothing has changed that much. Like I still sort of, scribble down lines that appear, ideas, images that come to me during mass, like when you're out and about, like I still have like, sometimes I'll write it down on my iPhone and like my notes, but usually it's just pen and paper. I think I'm working on a play right now about Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, and then, doing that historical research, being able to just like type into Google, like, can I fact checking this? Like, that's so helpful. Pulling up books on Google Books to like read through and like check something. So I think I also recently I'm working on a play. I'm performing the first bit of it's going to be performed at the Athenaeum in Chicago at the in the middle of May. And it's about a couple in California who, the first section of the play is really them sort of battling technology. And the second part of the play is them battling California weather. But I did, I think it was that play. Maybe it was that play. Yeah. I wanted something. I typed a line into ChatGPT because I wanted something written by a robot. Right. And so I used a line from ChatGPT. So I am using ChatGPT in my own art, just because it's like, okay, that's, it wasn't, I wasn't writing like a whole dialogue with ChatGPT, but I wanted to see what it would generate, and it became something that became commented on in the piece. So I guess I am using digital tools more than I realize in my own process.
Oh, David Foster Wallace said that he really got into footnotes because of the word processor. It made that very easy to do, whereas with a typewriter, it was very cumbersome. So you can see how these forms change. And then, the really, I think, clever artists begin to play with the form and draw our attention to the form. This is, again, what James Joyce did with language and literature, and what David Foster Wallace was doing with the novel. At the time, he wrote a ton on television. It'd be wonderful to have him around now to comment more on digital culture. Frank, again, from Austin, says that he agrees that the struggle is the learning, that he teaches his students that need to struggle. I often use the word friction, that, literally that friction between pencil and paper, but also anything that requires, that extra effort where the real growth happens. And we've had this conversation among writer friends with ChatGPT. When students view the essay as a product, something that you deliver to the teacher as a requirement, then the process doesn't matter as much. So I wonder if you could all comment, maybe again, just hovering around this process question. What is it about the process that is maybe the really satisfying part, or where the real learning and growth and creativity happens, versus the product, which is what most people see?
Well, I think, at least for me as a teacher, I often give students annotated drafts of works that are published. So we'll look at the published piece in a magazine or in a book at some point, but I'll show them the writer's notes, and sometimes I'll ask other writer friends to kind of give me their drafts that I can reproduce. And when they see that, because for the typical even high school student, any text that they encounter that is published, it almost seems to have magically appeared such as that way. So then it leans into what you say as the framing for their interaction with texts or with final texts. So if it demystifies that for them and shows them that everyone has a process, and then that is part of, for what I would think for me as a writer and a lot of writers, is finding that perfect draft is kind of the struggle and the pleasure of writing. That opens their eyes to the possibility of what writing is. It's not a utilitarian action. It's not something to make a finished product. It's the act of discovery. It's an essayistic kind of endeavor of self-understanding. So I think that is good. I also have students, I never get an essay from a student that they don't work on the page at some point. So even if it's them printing it out and editing on the page heavily before they turn it into me and then giving me those edits, I always want to see that encounter with a printed text, because I think that's important to, as I said, demystify it for them.
One thing, kind of something you said, Nick, is related to other conversations we've had about writing in ChatGPT. And I've just been kind of thinking about, after you and Brett were speaking about reading and books at the beginning as well, is it seems like what we're sometimes I think I conflate the technology with the process. So actually, I don't know how interested I am in preserving physical books. I mean, I love books, but it's the reading. So it's like, actually, that thing we all experienced when we would lose ourselves in a novel, where has that gone? It's that sort of experience. I feel there is more grief around that sort of having evaporated somehow from our lives and not knowing how. And then also this process of writing, where, like you were saying, Stephen, that's great that you can use these tools, but then where is it coming from, this interior, like, creative moment inside of you, that moment where you have this interior ideas and it's externalizing itself and incarnating itself on the page, in a sketchbook, on a stage, right? Like that. So I think that's something I've just sort of taken away from this conversation is, which I think Marshall McLuhan definitely covers, right? But this idea of, like, it's these processes and these sorts of internal shared experiences we all felt individually and knew that other people shared. Like, that's what we're trying. I feel like that's what I'm seeking to hold on to or make sure we don't lose in this new technological moment.
Let me ask you all this, and we have about 15 minutes. So again, encouraging our audience to drop in with questions. We have a enticing little comment about teaching poetry in a class in Seattle. And this person would like to know the role of poetry in the language shift of the digital age. Have you all thought about that, Nick, in particular? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, when I was in an undergraduate, it was a kind of an obsolescence moment with computers. We were kind of the Napster generation. Like, we'd have like 45, I should probably go to confession for this, but like 50 like downloads kind of going, and then we'd go to basketball practice or go to like hang out and then come back, and we have all these songs. And I remember the poets at our school, and kind of I was, writing poetry as well. There was like this movement to print out your poetry drafts, and you'd see like these kids walking around with clipboards, and they'd be like sitting outside, like under a tree or like kind of in like an outside area, and they'd be editing on the page. And it was this affirmation that even in that like early 2000s internet, kind of burgeoning internet world, they were holding on to language as being manually labored for themselves, and that they weren't editing on the screen. Like those were separate kind of entities. So I feel like any, I guess, doomsday approach towards technology that either puts it as we have to completely avoid it or we have to completely embrace it, I think doesn't engage with the possibility that we can be, as a few people have mentioned, shifting between the analog and the digital in a very dynamic way to affirm both of them kind of separately. And at least with poetry, as a few people have written about, I think there was a piece in the Atlantic about ChatGPT and poetry. There is literally kind of a soulless feeling to some of that poetry, and poetry, even some of the great Catholic poetry of recent time, like Franz Wright, for example, it feels uneven and messy in a very fascinating kind of way. And I feel like language is an imperfect medium anyway. So I feel that the more pure a poem sometimes becomes, the less maybe Catholic it feels. Like it has to have those rough edges. So at least for me, and when I come back from spring break, my students are starting poetry and creative writing. I'm kind of shifting between, do I want to do this on Google Classroom, Google Docs, where it's so much easier for me to grade and so much easier for them to comment, or do I want to go to like the clipboard, like outside, let's just kind of do it in that sort of mystical way. So I think it's good for poets to shift between those modes.
We've talked a lot about what we want to preserve as artists, writers, visual artists, what we don't want to lose. And I think these are, I think, the preeminent sort of considerations. But I think maybe the time remaining, and again, inviting questions and comments here, but the title of this is Renewing Christian Culture in a Digital World. What would the Da Vinci's and the Michelangelos do artistically, architecturally, et cetera, with these new tools that would elevate, enliven Catholic culture in general? And so rather than shying away from them, but sort of, as you said, Nick, walking that middle road between embracing full embrace and full rejection, to really do what Renée is talking about or pointing to, which is to say these things are servants to our craft. And so what does that, what's the potential there? Like in your wildest imaginations, if I could provoke a little bit, what's possible with what's emerging and what's happening now? And as you ponder that, I'll just bring in a comment that came in about virtual reality in a studio art class where the teachers brought in sculpting in virtual reality, which is then outputted through augmented reality. And this creates an output that puts the digitally created thing in a space that we currently occupy and experience as a group. So here's a great example of this sort of digital to analog and return to space idea. What are you guys thinking about?
Go ahead, Stephen. Yeah, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, I had to pause, Brett, when you posed the question, because what I've been thinking about as Nick was talking about poetry was that I remember there was a big project in grad school that I worked on, and actually I wrote a poem first. And in fact, every draft, like the first 4 drafts were different poems. And I think that's partly because I'm a visual thinker, and the poetry gave me access. It allowed me to move around what I was trying to gather together. And in some ways it expressed more powerfully what I wanted to say in the end. And then it was like the final step of the essay was to translate the poetry into prose. And so then what I was thinking about was, well, what might the great masters be doing? And I would hope that they would be returning us to a more symbolic worldview, and they would be producing things that not quite like a puzzle, which Nick also mentioned earlier, but almost more like a signpost, that hopefully the masters would be pointing us to the potential for the world to be a place of meaning making and to have depth behind it. And that's where I see actually the weakness in the technology in a lot of ways, is that it has all the surface appearance of, like, if you make something with artificial intelligence art, it has all the surface appearance of some surreal, whoa, mystical, what's going on here? But it's total randomness. Whereas something that is the true fruit of a person's, I don't know, meditative exploration of whatever question they're trying to answer in their art, then that is something worth revisiting. And it is an introduction to the symbolic world. And then that also points us back to creation. So anyway, that's why it was hard for me to answer your question, because I'm like, yeah, what do we preserve from this if it's pointing us away from the symbolic worldview? That I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm conscious that Nick also had something to say, but I was just going to sneak in and say that I think, how do we, I guess the question is, right, like, I think even that moment where I remember I first was trying out ChatGPT in preparation for a CCP conversation. And that moment you do it, like the moment you're like, oh, I'm going to like input a prompt and then get something back, there's a sense of awe and fun. And that's actually something very good, right? Like that's actually how delightful that and I think sometimes these pieces of technology come out of such a problematic technocratic worldview. They, impact young people, they change education. So like there's all these sorts of problems. But I think the moment, kind of what you're saying, Stephen, of like, how can we approach maybe technology with the sense of how do we sort of keep creation or the natural world or this very rich, symbolic, meaningful creation that we live in, this cosmos, as our ground, as sort of our foundation, and then approach this technology as like a funny thing man has made, right? Or like how do you sort of stay rooted in the natural world? And I was just thinking of, I think my favorite, probably the place on the internet I spend the most time besides Wikipedia is Google Maps. And I love Google Maps so much because I think it's the same sort of joy. There's lots of problems with it. We could get into those another time, but I think there is a moment where like Google Maps for me, like looking through Kyrgyzstan or like Tajikistan and like looking at like the Central Asian steppe deserts is incredible. And the fact that it's there on this website that I can access is really amazing. And I think I feel like as long as you foster, I think the question is, how do you foster in young people poetic sensibility, a sense of a symbolic reality, this sense of wonder, awe, and joy? Because even though you can then the problem is we can approach these tools, we can approach Google Maps with that formation, but that only encountering the world through Google Maps will never give you that formation itself. So I think that's, but I also am kind of wrestling with your question, Brett, and I know I'm going to be wrestling with it later, but that's sort of my one addition to Stephen's answer.
To be clear, Renee's not in the CIA, just a hobby of hers, looking at maps. Nick, you had a comment.
I was going to say that when I was thinking back to the kind of pandemic era teaching, like that year where we were in our homes and not together, and I've heard other teachers, rightfully kind of talk about issues with cheating and other problems, but I actually found that to be almost the best year of writing that I got from students in a long time, because it was almost like experimental and mystical, the kind of places that they went to. So there was like this forced monastic kind of solitude going on, and almost like the disorienting feeling of having language being the tethering to each other in a stronger way than it was when we were in the room together. So I guess like in my ideal vision of this, we find ways to have these kind of digital collaborations that retain that mystical kind of feeling to it, without, as other people have said, kind of reducing it to just using it like for plagiarism checks and like kind of that utilitarian view. So I feel like it's going to be the process for us to figure out, as writers and educators along the way. And also I think it's important to remember that all of us having this dialogue, kind of as panelists, we are coming to it, with that analog kind of memory, or sort of like the memory of the memory, and talking to someone who's 14 or 15, when they look at me when I talk about like dial-up internet, they have no idea, rightfully so, like what that is. But even like the screeching of that like call, and I feel like I'm talking about this now, and like attendees are probably like, what is the dial-up internet? Like I feel like that itself was kind of like an obsolescence phase. So it's just stuff that I think we're going to have to figure out as we go along.
Well, I want to be respectful of time. We're about at time for this excellent session, which, as I said, will be archived and posted on the McGrath Institute website for future viewing and sharing. If you're interested in these topics, I encourage you to visit our website, mcgrath.nd.edu. We have a program here called the Church Communications Ecology Program that studies these questions with parish ministers, teachers, people that work in dioceses all over the country, to think about this together, and to think about it in creative ways and hopeful ways, which I hope we've done today with our excellent artists. So before we depart, I'd like to again thank our panelists, Renée, Roden, Nick Ripatrazone, and Stephen Barany, for their excellent insights, and I encourage you to follow their work. The writers are easily accessible and findable online in their various written works, and Stephen's website has been posted to our chat for some of his visual work. And with that, I bid you all a happy Easter and deep gratitude again for joining us today. Thank you very much.